The crash was a nightmare, the kind no one ever expects to live through, but Captain Alex Rider wasn't given the luxury of disbelief. The moment the ship's hull screamed under pressure, the universe around him shaking with a violence that threatened to tear him apart. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning metal and fuel as the ship spiraled down in a deadly freefall. The view outside was a blur of jagged rocks and fire trailing behind the ship as it crashed through the atmosphere like a falling star ready to burn up and disappear forever. Alex's mind raced in the moments before impact, his hands gripping the controls like the only tether to sanity. He had left his thoughts scattered for just a heartbeat as he tried to brace for the inevitable. But there was no preparing for the earth-shattering impact when the ship slammed into the ground with a violent roar of metal and fire. The cockpit shattered around him, glass and debris flying every which way as the ship's twisted remains came to a halt in the thick jungle underbrush of an alien planet. Dazed and bleeding, Alex's first instinct was to move despite the pain, despite the fact his body screamed in protest. He had to get out of the wreckage. There were no other survivors, at least none that he could see through the haze of smoke and dust. His breath was ragged as he forced himself out of the seat and onto the floor. The ship's systems were dead, sparks flying from the dashboard as the emergency lights blinked weakly. But there was no time to dwell on it. He had to move. Every step was a challenge. His body was battered, his back slashed by jagged pieces of metal from the explosion. He could feel the wetness of his own blood soaking through his shirt, the world around him spinning. But he ignored it. The shit was gone. There was no rescue team coming. And he had no idea where he was or what the hell had just happened. But one thing was certain: he wasn't alone. A distant growl echoed through the jungle, the sound primal and deep. It sent a chill down Alex's spine, and for a split second, he thought it was part of the ship's systems malfunctioning. But then he heard it again, much closer this time. Not a malfunction, but something alive, something that could hunt him down. Alex's heart pounded in his chest, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm, but he quickly remembered it was gone, buried in the wreckage with the rest of his gear. He was unarmed and vulnerable to whatever creature had just announced its presence. He took a deep breath, forced his legs to carry him forward through the dense foliage, his mind racing for a way to escape. But the jungle wasn't quiet for long. The growl came again, louder and now more threatening, closer. It wasn't just a sound, it was a promise, a warning. And that's when he saw it in the corner of his eye, a movement so fast he'd barely registered it before it was right in front of him. The predator was massive, its body sleek and muscular, its fur a mixture of dark shades that helped it blend seamlessly into the shadows, its eyes glowing a blood red as it locked onto him with an unsettling intelligence. Alex froze, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as he stared into the eyes of the beast, its claws gleaming like knives in the dim light of the jungle. And for the briefest moment, Alex thought he saw hesitation in those eyes, a flicker of doubt before the creature lunged at him. He barely had time to react, his instincts kicking in just long enough to dive to the side, the alien's claws slashing through the air where he'd been standing a split second before. The ground trembled with the impact as the beast landed, its jaws snapping just inches from his face. His heart was racing, his back was screaming in pain as he scrambled to his feet, the adrenaline kicking in. But it was no use. The predator was faster, stronger, and it was relentless. Alex had no choice but to run. There was no time to think, no time to plan, just one thought in his mind: survive. The dense jungle worked against him, every step a struggle as vines and branches tore at his clothes and skin. But he kept moving, pushing himself harder than he ever had before, each breath painful, each step filled with the knowledge that behind him the predator was still there, still hunting. And in the back of his mind, the thought echoed again and again: how the hell was he going to survive this? Alex's lungs burned with every breath as he pushed through the dense underbrush, his legs feeling like they were about to give out with each step. But he couldn't stop, not now. The sound of the creature's pursuit was relentless, growing louder and closer, its growls echoing through the trees like a constant reminder that he was being hunted. The sweat dripping down his face stung his eyes as he fought to maintain his focus. Every movement felt like it drained more of his strength. The wound on his back ached with every movement, and his vision blurred from the pain. but still he ran forward his mind, refusing to acknowledge the fact that if he didn't get a lead, soon the predator would overtake him. The jungle around him seemed alive, its dense foliage, both a shield and a trap vines, tangled around his legs, pulling at his feet, as the weight of the planet's strange atmosphere seemed to push down on him. The heat, oppressive and suffocating, Alex couldn't afford to slow down, but every step became harder as the humidity soaked through his clothes, and his exhaustion grew. His muscles screamed for rest, but there was no time to stop, no time to think about anything other than escape. Through the trees he spotted a break in the landscape, a clearing ahead. It wasn't much, but it was his only chance, a brief respite where he could gather his bearings and hopefully find something to use to defend himself. He pushed harder, ignoring the stab of pain in his back as the ground beneath him became more uneven, his boots slipping on the wet earth. The clearing was within reach, but so was the creature. The beast was faster than he anticipated. It appeared in the clearing with a terrifying fluidity, its massive frame blocking his path. Before he could even take another step, the predator's blood-red eyes locked onto his figure, the creature's breathing heavy and labored, as though it had been chasing him for hours with a deadly determination. It crouched low, its muscles coiling, ready to pounce, its claws scraping the ground in anticipation. Alex's heart pounded in his chest, his back pressed against a thick tree, his mind desperately scrambling for any kind of plan, but he couldn't think straight. The only thing he could focus on was the creature in front of him, its eyes glinting with hunger, its jaws dripping with saliva, the space between them shrinking with every passing second. And just when it seemed like there was no hope, Alex caught sight of something at the edge of the clearing, a large rock formation, jagged and uneven, but it could provide cover, it could give him a chance. Without thinking, he made a dash for it, pushing his legs harder than ever. Despite the searing pain in his body, the predator roared in frustration and followed him, its massive form thundering after him. With alarming speed, Alex could hear its claws tearing into the earth as it gained on him with every stride, but he didn't dare look back. He focused solely on the rocks just ahead. He reached the formation with mere seconds to spare, diving behind the nearest boulder and pressing his back against the cold stone as the creature barreled into the clearing just moments behind him, its eyes searching the area, its head swiveling from side to side as it tried to pick up his scent. The thrum of his heartbeat was deafening in his ears as he stayed perfectly still, his breath shallow, his body tense as he waited for the predator to pass by. For a long moment, there was silence save the rustling of leaves in the wind and the heavy breaths of the alien beast just beyond the rocks, its frustration growing with each passing second. As it prowled around the formation, Alex's pulse quickened, his body trembling from the sheer terror of knowing it was only a matter of time before it found him. The space between them felt like an eternity, but the predator's search was methodical. It wasn't rushing, it was patient. It knew its prey would make a mistake eventually. The jungle held its breath, the tension building with every agonizing second. Alex could feel the sweat trickling down his spine, his back aching as he clutched the rock harder, his mind racing. He had no weapons, no tools, nothing to use against this thing but his own instincts, and those instincts screamed one thing: survival. But how long could he keep hiding? How long could he stay out of the creature's reach before it finally realized he was there? And then the sound came, a sharp crack from behind the predator's claws, slamming into a nearby tree, causing the trunk to splinter and break. The beast let out a growl of frustration, and Alex knew it was now or never. His window was closing fast. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, he sprang from behind the rock and bolted in the opposite direction, hoping against hope that the creature wouldn't catch him. Not this time, not yet. Alex ran without thinking, his body moving on pure instinct, his breath ragged as the pain in his back threatened to overwhelm him. But he couldn't stop, couldn't let himself think about the bloods soaking through his shirt, the exhaustion in his limbs, the fire in his lungs. All he could do was push forward and pray that he could outrun the alien predator that hunted him with a single-minded fury. The jungle blurred around him as he sprinted between the trees, the earth beneath his feet slick with mud and moisture, his boots slipping with every step. But his legs never faltered, not until he heard it again, the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against the ground. The predator was right behind him. Alex didn't dare look back. He couldn't afford the precious second it would take to glance over his shoulder. The growl of the beast was deafening now, its breaths hot on his neck. As the distance between them closed with every heartbeat, he could feel its presence like a shadow looming over him, the very air thickening with the creature's fury. His heart hammered in his chest, every beat a drum of impending doom. But still he ran forward, his body on the edge of collapse, the world around him spinning as he darted between trees, his mind barely able to process the jungle's labyrinth of twisted roots and overgrown vines. He had no clear direction, no plan except to keep moving, to keep the predator at bay just a little longer. Through the haze of adrenaline and pain, Alex suddenly spotted a break in the trees ahead, a ridge just beyond the jungle that might offer some sort of escape. Maybe he could climb, maybe he could get high enough to lose the creature, or at least slow it down. But his legs were burning with every step, his lungs screaming for air. But he couldn't stop, he had to keep going. The predator was closing in so close now that Alex could hear its claws tapping the ground rhythmically, like a countdown ticking down to his death. He could feel its eyes on him, could almost hear its hungry growl building in anticipation. But he was almost there, just a little farther, just a little longer. He reached the ridge, and with one final push, hurled himself upward, grabbing hold of the rocky face with bloody hands, his back on fire from the movement. But the ridge was steep and slick, with moisture. His fingers barely found purchase as he scrambled upward, his feet slipping with every frantic attempt to climb higher. Behind him, the beast let out a roar of frustration, its own massive claws digging into the earth as it closed the distance between them. But Alex refused to look down, refused to let himself think about the creature that was seconds away from reaching him. Instead, he focused on the sharp edge of the cliff above him, the ground becoming more distant with every upward scramble, his hands and arms burning from the strain. He was so close, his fingertips brushing the top of the ridge, when his foot slipped from the wet rock, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down. In that split second of weightlessness, he could feel the ground falling away from beneath him, his stomach lurching with a sudden loss of balance. But then with a grunt, he managed to get a foothold and pushed himself up just in time to hear the predator's claws scrape the rock below him. With one final heave, Alex pulled himself over the ridge and collapsed onto the uneven ground, his body shaking from the sheer relief of being out of the creature's reach. He lay there, panting, his back pressed to the cold earth, his chest rising and falling rapidly with every breath. But he didn't dare rest, not yet, not when he knew the creature was still out there, still hunting. The jungle below him was silent for a moment, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees and the pounding of his own heartbeat. But he knew it wouldn't last long. The predator would find a way up, it always did. Alex pushed himself to his feet, every muscle in his body screaming in protest, his mind still reeling from the adrenaline. But his survival instinct kicked in, and he began to move again, looking for a way to put more distance between himself and the creature. But the truth was in the back of his mind. He knew that this wouldn't last forever. Eventually, the beast would catch him. It was only a matter of time. And the thought gnawed at him as he moved forward, not knowing what would happen next, but knowing that he had no choice but to keep moving or risk becoming prey. Alex's mind raced as he staggered forward, his back still on fire from the earlier wounds, the jungle around him a blur of shadows and movement. But despite the pain, despite the fatigue, his only thought was survival. He had to keep moving. There was no time to stop and think about what had happened or what was happening. Only one thing mattered: escape. The predator would never stop hunting him. It would always be there in the shadows, waiting for its moment to strike. His steps were unsteady, his body weak from blood loss. But he couldn't afford to slow down, not now. The beast was still out there somewhere, lurking just beyond his vision. But he couldn't hear it anymore. The growls had faded into silence, and that terrified him more than anything else. The predator was waiting for him to make a mistake, and then it would pounce. Every instinct in Alex's body screamed at him to keep going, to move faster, to find higher ground, to escape. But the jungle seemed endless, and with every step he took, he only felt more lost. The towering trees blocked the sky, casting long dark shadows across the ground. The air was thick and humid, and every breath felt like he was choking on the weight of it. He had to focus, he had to think about his next move, But his mind was clouded with the pain his body was shutting down, his limbs growing heavier with each passing minute. The wound on his back was a constant reminder of how close he had come to dying, but somehow he was still alive, still moving one foot in front of the other, despite everything working against him. In the distance, he saw something strange, a flicker of movement that didn't belong, something out of place in the jungle's dense undergrowth. It was small, barely noticeable, but it caught his attention like a spark in the dark, and instinctively he made his way toward it, driven by a curiosity he couldn't suppress. The jungle seemed to press in around him. As he made his way forward, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and something else, something metallic. The movement was gone by the time he reached the spot where he had seen it, but the ground was disturbed, the leaves and dirt torn up, as if something had been there just moments before. His heart skipped a beat, and he crouched down to inspect the area, his fingers brushing the disturbed soil of his mind, racing with possibilities. But then his hand brushed something cold and smooth hidden beneath the earth. He pulled it free from the dirt. With a grunt of effort, a strange object shaped like a shard of glass, but metallic in nature, it shimmered in the dim light of the jungle, its surface marked with intricate symbols that Alex couldn't recognize. It was unlike anything he had ever seen on Earth or any other planet he had visited. His eyes narrowed as he examined it more closely. It was then that he heard it again, the growl, a low rumble in the distance. It was faint, but unmistakable. The predator was closer than ever, and suddenly, the object in his hand seemed like both a blessing and a curse. He had no idea what it was, or what it could do, but he couldn't afford to wonder about it, not now. He had to move. With the object clutched tightly in his hand, he forced himself to his feet and began moving again, the growl growing louder as the predator closed in, the sound of its claws scraping against the jungle floor, sending a jolt of panic through him. But this time Alex didn't run. He couldn't run anymore. His body was too weak, too worn down to keep up the frantic pace of escape. But he could fight, he could use whatever this object was to his advantage. He pressed forward, searching for some kind of cover or higher ground that might give him a better vantage point. But the jungle was oppressive, its dense foliage pressing in on him from all sides, and the sound of the creature growing ever closer was making it hard to think straight. His mind was racing with fear and exhaustion. But he knew one thing for sure: the predator wasn't going to give up. Suddenly he stumbled and fell forward into a patch of thorny vines, his face scraping the dirt as his hand shot out to catch himself, the object slipping from his grip and landing just out of reach. But that was the least of his worries. In the next instant, he heard the unmistakable sound of the creature's growl coming from directly behind him, and he knew there was no more time to think. He had no more options left. Alex scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding as the growl of the predator echoed through the jungle. His body screamed in protest, the pain from his wounds more intense with every movement. But he couldn't stop, he couldn't stay still. The creature was close now, closer than ever, and he could feel the heat of its breath on the back of his neck. The moment it pounced would be the end of him. He had to move faster, but his legs were failing him, his body weak and trembling from exhaustion and blood loss. Each step felt like it could be his last. The jungle stretched out in every direction, a maze of shadow and foliage that seemed to close in around him, no matter which way he turned. But there was nowhere to hide, no place left to escape. The predator had closed in, and it knew it. His eyes darted around desperately, looking for any kind of advantage, a weapon, a rock, a stick, anything that could give him a fighting chance. But all he found was more of the same dense jungle, the branches and leaves pressing in from all sides until he couldn't even see the sky anymore. The air was thick with humidity and the sounds of the jungle's many creatures. But the predator's growl was the only thing that mattered. It was a constant reminder that he was not alone. The creature was almost upon him now. He could hear its claws scraping against the ground, the air thick with the scent of its saliva. The predator was close enough for him to feel the vibrations of its steps beneath his feet. It was going to catch him, it was going to tear him apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But then he remembered the object, the strange shard of metal he had found earlier. It had to be important. It had to have some kind of purpose. He had no idea what it was or how it worked. But in that moment, it was his only hope. Without thinking, he reached down and graved at his fingers, closing around its smooth surface, the cold metal grounding him for a brief moment. He didn't know why, but something about the object gave him a sense of clarity, a feeling of connection, as though it had been meant for him to find it, as though it held some kind of power he couldn't yet comprehend. And with a sense of determination, he turned to face the predator, the creature's red eyes gleaming with hunger as it circled him, its growls growing louder, its jaws snapping in anticipation. Alex raised the object in front of him, his body trembling, but his grip firm. He didn't know what he was doing, but something inside him told him to hold it up to the creature, to show it to the beast, as though he were challenging it with nothing more than a piece of metal, a relic from an unknown world. The predator stoked, its circling, its eyes narrowing as it focused on the shard in his hand. For a moment, it seemed to hesitate, its growl dying down into something almost like confusion, as though the object was affecting it. Somehow Alex couldn't understand why, but he could feel the tension in the air. The creature's instincts were being disrupted by the object in his hand. It was something the predator had never encountered before, and it was making it question its next move. He pressed on the object tighter in his grip as the creature took another step forward, its claws scraping the earth. But this time Alex didn't flinch, he didn't run, he just held the shard steady in his hand, focusing on the strange energy it seemed to radiate in the silence between them. The predator seemed to grow uneasy, its growls no longer sounding as certain as they had moments before. Then it happened, the creature recoiled suddenly, its body jerking back, as though it had been struck by an invisible force. Its eyes widened in what could only be described as fear, and Alex's heart skipped a beat as he realized what was happening. The shard wasn't just affecting the creature, it was controlling it. It was sending out a signal that was forcing the predator to retreat. But Alex wasn't safe yet. The creature was only backing off for now. It was confused and disoriented, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. He had only a few moments to act before the predator regained its focus and came at him once more. His mind raced, his body still aching from the fight. But the object was his key. It was the only thing that could give him a chance to survive. He could feel the energy building within it, pulsing through his hand, as though it were alive, as though it were part of something bigger, something far more dangerous than just the creature hunting him. And in that moment, Alex realized the truth. The creature wasn't just a predator. It was a part of something more. It was a part of a system, something bigger than either of them. A system he had unknowingly become part of. The object wasn't just a weapon. It was a key to understanding everything that had brought him here and everything that was about to happen next. The predator circled again, and Alex steeled himself for what was to come next. He wasn't just fighting for survival now, he was fighting for something much bigger, something that could change everything forever. The predator circled him again, its eyes still glowing with a mix of confusion and primal fury, its growls growing louder as it realized the strange force the shard had created was not something it understood. The beast's body twitched and shifted as it tried to make sense of what was happening. Alex could feel the tension in the air like a thick fog surrounding them. He held the shard tighter in his hand, his pulse quickening, his mind racing with possibilities. He had no idea how this thing worked, but he had no time to figure it out. He had to act before the predator realized it could attack again. He took a step back, slowly inching toward a cluster of rocks that jutted out of the ground behind him. It wasn't much, but it could give him some cover if things went south. He had no idea if the shard was the key to escaping the creature or just a temporary defense, but it was the only thing he had at that moment. The creature's eyes flickered back and forth, as if trying to read him, trying to predict his next move. It was a hunter, and it was smart. But for the first time since the chase began, Alex could feel that he had the upper hand, even if only for a moment. The predator seemed hesitant, unsure of what to do next, and that was the opening he needed. Without warning, the creature lunged forward, its massive claws slashing the air, but Alex was ready. He held the shard up in front of him, hoping against hope that it would work again, that it would stop the creature in its tracks, and in a flash of bright energy, the beast screeched and jerked back, as though it had been struck by an invisible force, its body vibrating with the power of the object. Alex's heart raced as he watched the predator stumble backward, its growls turning into a howl of frustration. The energy coming from the shard seemed to ripple through the air like a wave crashing against a wall. The predator recoiled as though it had been burned, but Alex wasn't finished. He pressed forward, taking a step toward the creature, his hand still tightly gripping the shard as if it were his lifeline. The creature seemed to hesitate again, its posture shifting from aggressive to defensive, its eyes narrowing as it considered its options. Alex could feel the shift in the air like a current running through the jungle. Something was changing between them, something deep and primal. But it wasn't just the creature that was affected. The shard was doing something to him, too, something he couldn't explain. His senses were sharper, his thoughts clearer. The connection between him and the object felt stronger with each passing second. It was as if it was waking something inside him. The jungle around them fell into an eerie silence, the usual sounds of distant creatures and rustling leaves drowned out by the tension between Alex and the predator. He could feel the creature's eyes on him, every movement calculated, every step measured, as it tried to figure out how to overcome this new force that was keeping it at bay. Then it happened. The creature growled one last time before it launched itself at him with terrifying speed. Alex didn't have time to think, only to react. He raised the shard in front of him as the creature lunged. But this time something was different. The energy from the shard surged forward in a concentrated blast. The air crackled with power as the pulse from the object slammed into the predator, sending it flying backward into a nearby tree with a deafening crash. Alex stood frozen, his hand still raised as the creature lay crumpled against the tree, its body twitching, as if it were recovering from some kind of massive shock. But it wasn't moving any longer. The beast's once ferocious growls had quieted into an eerie silence. He couldn't believe it. The predator was down. It was unconscious, or worse. For now, it wasn't a threat. It wasn't hunting him anymore. Alex let out a long, shaky breath, his body trembling from the adrenaline and the sheer relief of survival. But even though the immediate danger had passed, he knew this wasn't over. The jungle was still full of dangers, and the shard was a mystery he had yet to solve. He took a step forward, cautiously keeping an eye on the creature as he approached it, but the predator didn't stir. It wasn't reacting at all. Alex couldn't help but wonder what exactly the shard had done to it. Had he only stunned it, or had he done something much more significant? He crouched down beside the creature, his mind racing as he looked at the strange markings on its skin that seemed to shimmer in the light of the fading day. The creature wasn't from this planet. It was an alien just like him in a way, and it occurred to him that maybe he wasn't just fighting for survival here. He was part of something much bigger, something he didn't yet understand. With a final glance at the creature, Alex stood up and turned away. He had to keep moving. He couldn't stay in one place for too long. He wasn't safe yet, and he didn't know what else this jungle might hold. But he knew one thing: the shard was his key. It was the only thing standing between him and certain death. And until he figured out what it really was, he would hold onto it like a lifeline. Alex continued to move through the jungle, his steps cautious, but determined. The weight of the shard still heavy in his hand. Every step felt like it echoed louder in the dense silence of the jungle. The predator was down, but Alex knew better than to assume he was safe. The creature could recover at any moment, or worse, there could be more of them hiding in the shadows waiting for him to slip up. He needed to keep moving, stay ahead, stay alive. There was no room for mistakes, not anymore. But as the exhaustion started to take hold of his body, and his vision blurred from the lack of sleep and constant strain, he couldn't help but wonder what he was really up against. Was this planet full of creatures like that predator? Was it only a matter of time before he encountered something else even worse? The jungle seemed endless. Every direction looked the same, and every turn brought him to more twisting vines and towering trees, as if the planet itself was trying to trap him in an unbreakable maze. The humidity clung to his skin, making every breath feel like he was suffocating. Slowly his body was pushing itself to its limits, but he couldn't stop, not when he had no idea what was out there waiting for him. And still the shard pulsed in his hand, the strange metallic object seeming to vibrate with some hidden power, something Alex couldn't understand, but felt deep in his bones. It was more than just a defense against the creature. It was something else, something far greater. He couldn't explain it, but he felt the connection growing stronger every time he held it. His mind felt sharper, his senses more attuned to the world around him, as though the object was unlocking something deep within him. The thought unsettled him. He had never been one to believe in mystical forces or strange alien technologies, But this shard was defying all logic. It was as though it was alive, somehow, as if it had a will of its own guiding him, in ways he didn't fully understand yet. But the more he held onto it, the more he felt that strange energy coursing through his veins, and it scared him. He stumbled through the undergrowth, his hands brushing against the thick leaves that seemed to close in around him. But his mind was elsewhere, his thoughts racing with possibilities. Could the shard be a weapon of some kind? Or was it something more, something that could change everything about the way he understood the universe? And then he heard a soft rustling in the bushes. Just ahead of him, his body froze, his senses on high alert, the jungle's silence, shattered by the unmistakable sound of movement. Was it another predator or something else entirely? His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly crouched down, his eyes scanning the area ahead of him, looking for any sign of what might be waiting there. The rustling grew louder and closer, and Alex could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up with the anticipation, his breath caught in his throat, his hand tightening around the shard as he prepared himself for whatever was coming. But then the movement stopped, it was completely still, and for a moment there was nothing but the sounds of distant creatures in the jungle, the air thick with tension. He held his breath, waiting for any sign of danger, but nothing came. The silence was absolute, and just as he was about to release the breath he had been holding, a figure emerged from the bushes in front of him, and for a moment Alex's mind couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. It was a person, but not like any human he had ever encountered before. This figure was tall and lean, its skin was a deep shade of green, its eyes an unnatural shade of gold that seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. The person wore strange clothing that looked like a blend of armor and organic material, almost like it was grown rather than made. But it was the air around this being that caught Alex's attention. There was something powerful about them, something familiar and unsettling at the same time. The figure didn't speak, but its gaze locked onto Alex with an intensity that made him feel exposed, as though it could see straight through him. It wasn't threatening, but there was a presence about them that felt like it was more than just a simple encounter. This was no random alien. This was something different. Alex's grip tightened on the shard instinctively, his body tensing as he prepared for anything, but the figure didn't move. It only stood there, watching in its golden eyes, never leaving his face. He took a step back, unsure of what to do, unsure if this being was friend or foe, but his mind was racing, trying to make sense of the situation. Was this another survivor from the crash, or something entirely different? The figure's lips parted, and for a moment Alex thought it might speak, but instead of words, a low hum filled the air, a sound that resonated deep within his chest, a strange energy that seemed to flow from the being to him, and suddenly he felt a deep sense of recognition. Something inside him clicked, something he couldn't explain. The figure raised its hand slowly, palm facing outward, as if in a gesture of peace, and for the first time since arriving on this planet, Alex felt a flicker of hope. But he was cautious. He had learned not to trust anything, not when his survival was at stake. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was a moment of choice, a moment that would define what came next. The figure's hand remained outstretched toward Alex, its golden eyes never leaving his face, and for a long moment there was only silence. The jungle around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. Alex's heart hammered in his chest, his grip on the shard tightened, even though every part of him wanted to trust the figure. Something inside him told him to remain cautious. He had survived this long by trusting his instincts, and right now they were telling him that this wasn't a safe moment, not yet. The figure didn't move, its gaze steady, but not threatening. The hum that resonated from it seemed to grow louder, vibrating in the air around them. Alex felt it deep in his chest, almost like a pulse, something alive, something that carried power. But whether that power was meant for him or against him, he couldn't tell. Slowly, Alex took a step back, keeping the shard held firmly in front of him, as though it was the only thing between him and whatever this being was. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. What did this being want? Why was it here? And most importantly, was it an ally, or was it another threat? The figure's hand lowered slightly, but it didn't retreat. It remained standing in place, watching him with that same steady gaze. The hum faded slightly, but there was still an energy in the air, one that seemed to draw Alex in despite his reservations. "Who are you?" Alex's voice cracked as he spoke the first words he had said. In what felt like an eternity, he had no idea what language the figure spoke, or if it even understood him, but the words had left his mouth before he could stop them. The figure's eyes flickered for a brief moment, and Alex thought he saw something like understanding in its gaze. It tilted its head slightly as though it was considering his question, but still it didn't speak. Instead, the hum began again, more intense this time, and with it came a feeling, a wave of something that felt like communication, but not in words. It was more like a presence, an awareness that spread through the air between them like a silent conversation. Alex's head spun as the sensations washed over him. He tried to focus, but the more he tried to understand, the more overwhelming it became. It wasn't painful, but it was suffocating, almost like the air was thickening around him, making it hard to breathe. Then it stopped just as suddenly as it had started. The jungle returned to its eerie silence, and the figure stepped back slightly, its hand now resting at its side, but it was still watching him, its golden eyes never leaving his face. Alex's mind reeled. The connection, the energy he had felt, was something beyond anything he had experienced before. It was like the shard had triggered something within him, something that allowed him to sense what this being was trying to communicate, but the message was still unclear. He had no idea what it meant or how to interpret it, but he knew one thing for sure: this being was not a simple alien. It was something more, something that held a power beyond his understanding. He had no answers, but in that moment, he realized something else too. Something deep inside him told him that this encounter wasn't just by chance. It wasn't a random meeting. This was the next step in a much larger journey, a journey that he had no choice but to follow, even if it terrified him. The figure took another step back, then turned its body toward the jungle, as though signaling that it was time to move on, and without another word, it began to walk away, its movements fluid and effortless, like it was part of the jungle itself. Alex stood frozen for a moment, still unsure of what to do, but he knew he couldn't stay where he was, not with everything happening, not with the danger still lurking out there. The figure had shown him a way forward, and despite all the uncertainty, he couldn't ignore it. With a final glance at the figure's retreating form, Alex gripped the shard tighter and began to follow. Alex followed the figure through the jungle, his steps cautious, but determined, the creature's presence still fresh in his mind. But now his thoughts were focused on the being ahead of him, the strange alien who had shown him something more, something he couldn't explain, but couldn't deny. That the jungle seemed to shift around them as they moved, the path ahead clearing slightly with each step, like the forest itself was guiding them. But Alex couldn't shake the feeling that this was all part of a bigger plan, something that had been set into motion long before he ever arrived on this planet. The figure moved ahead without looking back, its movements so fluid and effortless. It was as though it belonged to the jungle as much as the trees and vines themselves. Alex's mind raced with questions. Why had it spared him? Why had it come to him in the first place? What did it want from him? What was this connection that he felt pulsing through his veins, like a distant echo from something ancient, something powerful? The jungle grew quieter as they moved deeper into its heart, the sounds of distant creatures fading into nothingness, the air thick with the scent of earth and something else, something unfamiliar, but still strangely comforting. The figure paused for a moment, and Alex nearly bumped into it as he tried to keep up, but the being turned its head slowly, its golden eyes locking with his once more, and for a moment Alex felt like he was falling into them, like they were pulling him deeper into something he couldn't understand. Without a word, the figure gestured for him to follow, and Alex did, his heart still pounding in his chest, unsure of what was happening. But he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't turn back, not now, not when he had come this far. The shard in his hand felt heavier with each step, almost as though it were reacting to the figure's presence, to the jungle itself, the energy from it shifting as they moved. Finally, they arrived at a clearing, a wide-open space in the heart of the jungle, and Alex felt an overwhelming sense of awe as he stepped into it. The air was different here. It hummed with a strange power. The ground beneath his feet felt alive, like the very earth was pulsing with energy. In the center of the clearing was a large stone structure, unlike anything Alex had ever seen. It was ancient, covered in vines and moss, but there was something undeniably powerful about it, something that made his skin crawl with anticipation. The figure stopped in front of the structure, its golden eyes scanning it before it turned back to Alex, and nodded as if confirming something. Alex wasn't sure what to do or what was expected of him, but as the figure stepped forward toward the stone, he felt a sudden surge of energy from the shard. It pulsed in his hand, sending waves of heat through his body, and his mind began to clear. For the first time he understood the connection between them. The figure was leading him here, to this place, to this structure, and the shard was the key. It was the missing piece, the thing that would unlock whatever secrets this place held. But even as the realization hit him, he couldn't shake the fear that clung to him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was something bigger than he had ever imagined. The figure turned toward him, once more, its eyes filled with something that resembled understanding, and then it stepped aside as if waiting for him to take the next step, to make the choice that would determine everything from here on out. Alex took a deep breath and stepped forward, his mind racing with questions, but his heart steady as the shard pulsed once again in his hand, guiding him toward the unknown.